NATO continue to insist that if they can stay unified and keep pouring money and weapons into Ukraine, all will be well. I'd like to begin by asking you for your assessment of this present strategic situation.
Well, I think that the Western establishments seem to believe their own narrative. But narratives are unfortunately not the reality. The reality is that, you have right now an unbelievable process going on. You have the definite crisis in the West with all the symptoms you just described. You have the absolute determination of the countries of the global South to no longer be, the colonial slaves of that unipolar world, and they are definitely moving in the direction of establishing a multipolar system, which is not the end of the wisdom in my view. But, so there is this tendency, and what is happening, I think most worrisome, is that this determination to keep the unipolar world, send more weapons to Ukraine, is leading increasingly to a situation where the war danger is actually, in my view, increasing by the day. And, step by step, we are moving closer to a possible catastrophe. For example, Vladimir Yermakov, who is the head of the arms control and the non-proliferation and arms control department of Russia, he just put out a warning saying that, not only is the New START treaty in danger, but with that the entire fate of humanity, and that all the calls coming from Russia to the West to notify this increasing danger are finding deaf ears. And I think, on the other side, you have such things like a clear effort to unite the EU with NATO in a global NATO. I mean, this Borrell, Joseph Borrell, the so-called foreign minister of the EU, he is calling for increasingly European navies to patrol the strait between mainland China and Taiwan, which has been absolutely rebuked sharply by China, obviously, because, this is what does the EU have to do with Taiwan? So, I think we are really moving very much in a more and more dangerous direction. And I think the demand, the same Borrell, by the way, there was just a EU European Foreign Council meeting in Brussels, where Borrell basically said that they have now decided on a plan of action, which is designed to put maximum pressure on the countries of Africa, of Latin America, of Asia, to take sides and join with the so-called democracy to counter the narrative of Russia, to basically, not go with economic ties with China. And that in a situation, where it is very clear that, for example, on the question of the narrative around Ukraine, what led to this catastrophe, all the African nations did not vote with the West on the explanation of the narrative. And that is because they have their own experience, with these same colonial powers. And so, it's a futile effort to try, to win over the developing countries. I mean, the way to win over the developing countries would be very simple. If the EU would have done, in terms of economic investments in Africa, what China has been doing in the last 10 years, there would be no problem, because, then the Africans would not turn against the West. But the saying in Africa right now is that if you deal with China, you get an airport or you get a railway. If you're listening to the Americans or the Europeans, you get a sermon and no economic aid. So, I think the West is really not realistically looking at the situation, and the effort to continuously pursue a unipolar world, even go for the destruction of the Russian Federation, which, there is a whole series of conferences today, this week in Washington, by the so-called post-Russia forum. And that in a certain sense, spells disaster. So I think the West is clearly, run by an apparatus which is heading towards a catastrophe. And just to mention that as a major factor, the situation in Germany is absolutely catastrophic. In Germany, the economic bottom is falling out. We see the mass bankruptcy of medium-sized and medium and small industries, Mittelstand. We see an absolute escalation in, basically the ending of any sign of relation between Germany and Russia. That has been totally ruined. And, I think that we are heading towards a perfect storm in Germany alone, because, what people are expressing in the streets is that, how did we get here? How comes that we have a foreign policy and an economic policy which leads to the absolute ruin of Germany? How did we get there? And I think this will not go on for long. So, I think we are in an unbelievable situation where, it would be so easy to solve it, but it would require that the West is taking an attitude of cooperation with the global South instead of trying to continuously impose an unipolar world, which in reality has long gone. So I think it's a very dangerous moment, and I have expressed it in other occasions. I think if people would be aware how close we are to the possible annihilation of civilization, because if it comes to a nuclear confrontation between the major nuclear powers, then that's the end of civilization. So I think people are not really in reality who don't see it that way.
You're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the chairwoman of the Schiller Institute, and this is our weekly dialogue. If you have questions for Helga, send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org. I want to just follow up on what you just said about Germany, because the foreign minister of Germany, the green ideologue and war hawk, Annalena Baerbock, was just in China. What was the outcome of that trip? I mean, she was very ungracious to her Chinese host. So what do you think was the ultimate outcome from the trip?
Well, I think she just went there to basically, tout her own view of the world. And I think the Chinese have drawn their conclusions out of it. I think this is very damaging to the Chinese, European, Chinese-German relations. And I think this woman is saying things. I don't think she is alone. I think she's, I have this image that she's really, joined at the hip with Anthony Blinken, and they always appear jointly at events like the Munich Security Conference or other occasions. And I don't think she's representing the interest of Germany at all. That is the growing perception of a growing number of people in Germany. And I think she is not representing the interest of Germany in the slightest.
Now, I have a couple of questions here from people who are asking for your assessment of the article in the Washington Post, which said that Ukrainian General Budanov was planning strikes into Russia on February 24th, but the U.S. put pressure on him not to do it. Do you think this is real, that there actually was such a plan? And why would the Washington Post report it?
Well, I don't know if it's real. It's very difficult to say. But, there was this series of leaks, the Pentagon leaks, which then were attributed to this 25-year-old member of the National Guard, which is not very likely. More likely is that these leaked documents were somehow given to him and he played with them around in the internet. But, there is a continuous leaking of such plans. And I think, the most likely explanation is that it comes from people inside the establishment, inside the security apparatus, either military or intelligence, of people who may not be different than the establishment, but who are more realistic and see the consequences of where this confrontation could lead to in the short term. Now, given the fact that, you have basically one of the main statements in these leaked documents was that the US intelligence, the CIA, that they were absolutely not convinced that Ukraine was winning on the military field, and that they had not made it public. Now, that is alone already an extremely bothering and disturbing thing, because if the U.S. military or if the U.S. administration thinks the Ukrainian are not winning and they keep saying publicly the opposite, well, what does that reflect in terms of how much they care for the Ukrainian people who are the victims of that? Obviously, it's also extremely unfair, to say the least, towards the European allies who are supposed to send more weapons to Ukraine, and countries like Germany become increasingly the potential target of such adventures, to put it mildly. And obviously, these leaks have completely undermining the trust, because if everybody has the feeling they're being not only not told the truth of what the US thinks, but they're being spied on all the time, I mean, that tends to erode the trust. It may not show up in one day, but it definitely has a long-term effect. And if this particular story is true, it could very well be. I mean, we should be mindful of the fact that the United States government and the US political side and the military side, they are not exactly the same thing, and there are different views. General Milley already some time ago had called for negotiations, and there was even a recent article in Politico which says that, basically the US view is that the Ukrainians are not winning. And Haas, who is the head of the Council of Foreign Relations, said that if the Ukrainians are not winning, which is what it seems, then maybe that's the time to consider negotiations. Then on the other side, you have the hawks, who are demanding more weapons, and then you have naturally the British, who had the most outrageous examples of encouraging people in Ukraine to retake Ukraine, to have a Cuban crisis on steroids. So you have all these different voices. So I can very well imagine that, that this did happen, that affection both in Ukraine being stirred up. Ukraine is not an independent force. They're being stirred up by either forces inside the United States or the British, that they did indeed contemplate such strikes on Russian territory, but that then maybe some more reasonable forces intervened and stopped it, and that the Washington Post, just leaked it for their own purposes, which, given the fact that they have a new ownership since a while, could have different interpretations. So I think this is all, showing how close we are to the edge, because obviously if there would have been such strikes, it would have for sure caused a tremendous reaction on the Russians, and then we would have been within a very, very short time of hours and minutes in the kind of spiral of escalation which could really lead to a disaster. And I think people should really reflect on that. The thing which is completely ununderstandable, that there are not more people speaking out when you see that we are so close to the possible extinction, annihilation of civilization. If it ever comes to such a conflict, direct conflict between the two largest nuclear powers in the world, what happens then, would leave absolutely no record of human existence, and there would be not even a historian left to investigate why this happened. And that's what people have to cope with.
We have a question from Colin Hamill, speaking of this question of providing more weapons to Ukraine. He asked the question, does anybody know where all the ammunition for the China war is going to come from? The EU can't afford to do it, neither can the US. And putting the time frame back to 2027, which is one of the latest comments from the US military, seems to give China time to build up defenses. So what are they trying to do with this?
Well, I mean, the Rand Corporation already many years ago had a study which basically said that the sooner the war with China occurs, the better, because the longer it takes, the more China will build up, and the more it will be to the disadvantage of the United States. Now, I think that that is again one thing which we have to really find an alternative, because if the two largest economies would enter a war, and I'm absolutely certain that it would not remain a regional war, but it would immediately escalate into a general world war. That must be prevented. I think that more people have to wake up and say that even such war games are crazy. They are insane. They should not happen. And now obviously a lot has been destroyed in terms of trust, in terms of potential for good relations, but it's not yet too late. I think that the questioner is quite right that right now the inability of the entire West to provide, quote, enough ammunition for Ukraine naturally means that the idea to entertain the idea of a war with China is sort of ludicrous. But the idea, that you would wait and the hope would be to gain more people, more bases in the Indo-Pacific, to engage more countries into this. This is a dynamic which must be interrupted. And that is why, my position has been, and the Schiller Institute has been very emphatic on that we need a new security and development architecture which stops this insane geopolitical confrontation, because nobody can be the winner. We need a new security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country, and we can all live together in an earth where each country develops. We have an urgent need to uplift the economic situation of the global South. That's why these countries are moving the way they do, because they do not want anymore to be in a colonial condition. And the sooner there are sane forces inside the United States and in European nations. I have sort of given up on the EU Commission, because I think they are so ideologically blind that you need a return of sovereign nations in Europe who go back to the policy of Charles de Gaulle and alliance of European fatherlands to represent the interest of the European nations. We should have a cooperation which includes the United States, Russia, China, and all the other nations, and then we should go for overcoming poverty, stop the casino economy, invest in real projects, in physical goods, uplift the economic country, the economies of the countries of the global South. And then we have many other great tasks to solve together, and that is the shift which we have to undertake, or we will not make it as a human species.
We have a question that I'll get to in a moment, which will give you an opportunity to discuss the economic solution. But this just came in from the chat room. As you know, Joe Biden just announced he's a candidate in 2024. There's a huge amount of hubbub in the United States about Trump, the legal cases against him, the firing of Tucker Carlson. There's just a lot going on. But the question that's asked is the political fight in the United States of both Democrats and Republicans just to make people more polarized? How do we make real change if both parties are funded from the same donors?
Well, I think that is why, you have right now the mobilization of many of the so-called small parties and third parties. And, if this continues, I mean, I think Biden has proven that he is more hawkish than any previous president. I think Trump, I don't know what the situation is in terms of his legal the fights, which are obviously all designed to prevent him from becoming the candidate. He has announced that he will run anyway. So, but, what is needed is something completely different. And that is, for example, independent candidate for Senate in New York State, Diane Sayre. She has turned out to be a leading voice for a real alternative by, having a program which would bring the real American tradition back of the American Revolution, the American system, the policies of the founding fathers, of John Quincy Adams in terms of foreign policy, in terms of Lincoln, in terms of Roosevelt, in terms of Kennedy. And that tradition is what needs to be revived in the United States. So let's see what will happen with the announcement of Robert Kennedy. There is a lot of discussion. Is that real? Is it not real? I mean, for example, the head of the People's Party, Nick Brana, was a leading member in the Bernie Sanders campaign, and he split because Bernie Sanders turned out to be such a disappointment. So there is a lot of things in flux, but I think, the United States obviously is in a absolute test of its own, tradition. How could the United States, which started so promising, which was a beacon of hope and a temple of liberty for all the progressive forces around the world, during the time of the American Revolution, people like Friedrich Schiller, they looked up to the United States, and that this is where the question of freedom is being discussed. He mentioned in the Don Carlos, be a king of a million kings. That was the idea of the American Revolution, contrary to the French Revolution, which said we have to have equality by using the guillotine, and everybody gets their head chopped off. Like Robespierre, he said the revolution doesn't need scientists, and many of them were executed. Against that was the American Revolution, an absolute example where people would give themselves a constitution which, said sovereignty not only for the present generation, but for the common good of all future generations is what this republic is being made for. And that was expressed also in the Declaration of Independence. So, how did the United States, of having such a high ideal, plunge into the present depths of trying to think that they have to defend the role of the United States based on the special relationship with Britain to be, the hegemon of an unipolar world, which is a global leviathan, where basically military force is what keeps everybody under control. Now that is something where I really think that much more intellectuals in the United States should discuss this. I mean, it cannot be that all the greatness of America would basically be forgotten, and that brute force is the only thing which is left. So, I know it's a difficult situation because, in Germany we had the same problem where Germany plunged from, the height of German classic period of Schiller, of Beethoven, of, other great composers and poets. And then we had the disaster of the Nazi period. So it can happen to countries that they lose their height of culture and plunge into a dark age. But, I think it is a challenge to the American people to rally around those people who are there and who are offering an alternative. And there are fortunately many. And if you want to know, then go to the Sayre for Senate website and look at the event she had last Saturday, where a lot of excellent people were speaking, from Stephen Starr talking about the danger of nuclear war, to Scott Ritter, to Nick Brana, to many others. And you get a sense that there is another America actually evolving, not yet strong enough to be the decisive factor, but there is an opposition. And I think that's very important for the rest of the world to know, because if you think that the United States policy of, confrontation with Russia and China is the only thing there is, people get desperate. And I have met many people in the recent period who are getting quite despaired, because they don't see an option. So this is why the emergence of the real America expressed by Diane Sayre and the people she's working with is really very important.
And speaking of the real America, we're dealing with something that you've been talking about quite a bit and that the Schiller Institute has been addressing, which is what I call the disinformation industrial complex. It was recently again exposed by the release of the testimony of the former acting director of the CIA, Mike Morell, who acknowledged in testimony, congressional testimony, that it was Tony Blinken, then an advisor to the Biden campaign, who planted the story, which went out later in a letter that Morell drafted, signed by 50 intelligence operatives, about the Biden laptop being Russian classic disinformation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I really don't. I decline.
Okay. Now, there are a couple questions on the economy that I think are very useful. Well, here's one from Pablo, who asked if we think that when the debt ceiling negotiation is deadlocked between Republicans and Democrats, that is the disagreement over whether the debt ceiling should be raised, the growing amount of debt that's affecting the government, but of course debt throughout the whole economy. Is it possible that the US and NATO would launch a military counteroffensive to take attention away from what's happening with the economy?
Well, I think, that is sort of happening already because, I think that, if you don't look only at the events on a day by day or week by week basis, but if you look at the underlying dynamic, what is the reason why we have this crisis right now? In 1971, when Nixon took the dollar from the gold standard and introduced the floating exchange rates, my late husband at that point made the prognosis that if you would continue on that road to profit maximization, to speculation instead of production, that this would lead to the crisis which we experience today. And, in a certain sense, that is what has happening in the last 50 years. You had the deregulation of the markets, you had the casino economy, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and that all of that has led to a situation where the actual money side of the economy, of the financial system, was completely decoupled from physical investments. That has led to a very large extent of the destruction of any kind of Mittelstand, middle-sized industry in the United States, because all these firms were outsourced to China and then to other countries of the global south. So the actual industrial base of the United States has shrunk, because it has been outsourced. And the only thing which is left is the military industry, which is, functioning but not very productive for the actual common good. It's profitable for the people who have invested in the military side of things, but it does not lead to the strength of the actual economy. And that has been going on now for 50 years. In Europe, it was a little bit different. You used to have a functioning German economy up to a point when the privatization of everything started and the going to the exchange rates, exchange markets. And, basically there has been a erosion since some time as well, but only with the recent green policy, it's reaching this disaster. But in any case, both the EU and also the United States have incredible economic collapse. For example, the growth expectation for this year, I think in the EU is something like, I may be off by a percentage or not, but I have the figure of 0.3%, while the inflation rate is average 8 or something like that percent. So there's de facto an actual collapse, while Asia is rising. And it's not just China. China obviously has become the locomotive, the economic locomotive of the world economy, but also the other countries who are cooperating with China in the Belt and Road Initiative, they're doing much, much better. So I think the average growth rate for Asia is something like 4 or 5%. And, if the United States is following the PNAC policy, the Project of a New American Century doctrine, that they will, the Wolfowitz doctrine, where they don't allow any country in the world or any group of countries to become stronger economically, socially, politically, than militarily than the United States, then that rise of China is the real reason why all of this conflict exists. And naturally, given the fact that, Russia is now in a very strong strategic alliance with China, the two somehow go together. So I think that is really going on already, and therefore, it's all the more urgent and actually good that there is now a renewed discussion about the need to have Glass-Steagall. Marcy Kaptur in the United States has announced that she will relaunch the Glass-Steagall Act, which is very good. In Switzerland, you have a big debate in the different levels of parliament about the reintroduction of banking separation, and even the regional press in Switzerland today reported about the fight for Glass-Steagall inside the United States, so that the people in Switzerland are aware of similar efforts going on elsewhere. So I think that is all very interesting, and we will not get out of this crisis until you have a full reorganization of this financial system, because if the crisis continues, the tendency to have an increase of the military conflict will increase, until it comes to a point of decision one way or another.
Well, there's someone who's responding to what you said about the difference between de Gaulle's conception of Europe and the current conception of the European Union. From Svetlana, she asks, is there a single potential leader of the size of de Gaulle or someone of that sort in Europe to get Europe back on the right path?
I don't see it. I mean, Macron has recently made some useful statements by demanding that Europe should more look out for its own interest and not be drawn into a conflict between the United States and China over the Taiwan crisis. I think that, but then Macron has big opposition inside France, because he's trying to introduce this pension reform, which the population reads as not just increasing the age when people can enter their pension, but that it is the sacrificing of the issues of the common good in favor of a war economy. And that is, what weakens Macron's position. I mean, I don't see anybody in Europe right now who would fill the shoes of de Gaulle. Unfortunately not, no.
Okay, and then we have a question from our friend Bruno Romano from, I believe he's from Rome. He asks for an explanation of the relationship in your husband's writings between the creative evolution of the human species and the increase in potential relative population density. He said, it seems to him that for LaRouche, this is a fundamental law of human evolution, and he'd like you to comment on that.
Yes, that's quite right. It is, I think, the most important yardstick, because the argument my late husband made was that the increase of the relative potential population density is a must. The reason is that, obviously the thesis of the Club of Rome about the limited resources is completely stupid and wrong, and was a deliberate lie to create the environmentalist movement. There is an element of truth, and that is that if you stay with one level of technology, then you enter a relative limit of resources, because sooner or later the resources on that level will be exhausted. but it is exactly what differentiates the human species from all others, that we are gifted with creative reason, and therefore we can all the time, always discover new physical principles. That is called science and technology. And when you apply the scientific progress in the production process, it leads to an increase of the productivity of both the labor power, the industrial capacities, the living standard, the longevity. And that is how we got from a small population before the last ice age of maybe 5 or 10 million. And if you would have stayed at that level, it would have never come to, it would have led to an exhaustion and the kind of consequences the Club of Rome stupidly is warning for. But we were able to make incredible discoveries. If you think, just go in a conscious way through the city where you live, and you look at how everything is organized. Hospital systems, communication, energy. The whole way how society has evolved to be a highly sophisticated, integrated organism all over the world, that is the result of millions and millions of discoveries. And each of these discoveries had to be measured. Are they leading to an increase of the relative potential population density? Then they are useful. And, that is a law of the universe, because exactly what I said. And also, to make such discoveries and to continue that process of knowing the physical laws of the universe more in depth does require a higher division of labor. Because if you want to be better, then you have to have more experts. More experts need longer studies. To be a specialist in astronautics or in deep water experiments, you need to study not until you're 25. Maybe you have to study until you are 40, and then you can make a breakthrough. And that requires more division of labor, more diversity, more longevity, because you cannot die with 50 when you already ended studying with 40. And that means, the increase of science and technology, the increase of productivity, the increase of relative potential density is the law of the universe. And that is what gives you a yardstick if something politically, economically, socially is, in quote, good or bad. Because, if you have an invention which is not leading to such an increase, it is bad. Like, for example, all the investments or most of the investments in green technology are actually destructive, because they do not lead to an increase of the relative potential population density, and therefore they are a dead end. And the thing is, the Greens know that absolutely. We participated in some meetings many years ago where they openly were discussing that the whole point is to get all the investments in green technology, because then they will not be available for other technologies which are based on a higher energy flux density. And, they consciously want to reduce the world population and turn it back to less than 1 billion people on this planet. But that is exactly what does not function. That is exactly why the zero growth ideology is potentially leading to a real ecological catastrophe. So there were scientists in Russia like Boris Kuznetsov, who had invited my late husband at one time to come to Russia and lecture in his academy. And he made the famous statement where he said that specific discovery about the need to have the increase of the relative potential population density is the most crucial contribution LaRouche made, and therefore he predicted that it will soon be called the law, because crucial inventions are always called according to their inventor, like volt or watt or, other such inventions, and that the La, standing for LaRouche, will be the name of measurement. How do you judge if an economic investment is increasing that measurement or not? So indeed, it is the most crucial question of the laws of the universe, because that human activity is a part of the physical universe. And that's what people sometimes overlook.
To their own discomfort and damage to the future. Helga, we have time for one last question, which comes from Zambia. It's about the proposal made by Sergei Lavrov in the UN Security Council on a move toward multilateralism. The question is, will Russia's proposal that was made to the UN Security Council be taken seriously by members, and what impact do you expect it will have?
Well, I think what Lavrov said is the trend of the time. Multipolarity is already happening. I mean, there's no way how the countries of the global south will go back to agree to an unipolar world. The Belt and Road Initiative of China this year has its 10th anniversary. That has resulted in about 150 countries of the globe cooperating with China on this new Silk Road conception. You have the Belt and the BRICS countries. The leadership of the BRICS this year is South Africa. Beginning of June, they will have their summit of the foreign ministers. And in that context, it was just announced that 19 countries have applied for membership in the BRICS. I think 13 of them in a formal way and 6 of them in a preliminary informal way. And naturally, they will go through some procedures to look what are the conditions for application and membership. So it will not be like one day, but it will be a process. So you have this, then you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have the African Union, you have the ASEAN, and so you have a multipolarity already. But, I think that the multipolarity is better than unipolarity for sure. But it still has the danger of geopolitics, that you have the pursuit of interest of one group against the interest of another group, and that still has the danger of war. And I think in the times of thermonuclear weapons, war must be out as an option of problem solution and conflict solution or resolution. And that's why, I think we have to move to a new paradigm in thinking. And I have proposed quite some time ago the idea of Nicolaus of Cues to think in terms of the coincidence of opposites. Now, this was a method of thinking which Nicolaus developed in the 15th century, and he was very proud, saying that he discovered something which no human being before him had ever thought of. And that was the idea that the human creative mind can think a high level above the conflicts, the one which has a higher order than the many. And then naturally he came to this idea in theological, discussions, that came really from the idea of how can one describe God, the negative theology. He said that no notion which a human person can give to God will be adequate, because God will be always so much above anything a human person can conceptualize. And he had many interesting discussions, like the non-other is none other than the non-other. This is a very good exercise for your mind, where you are forced by Cusanus not to cling to sensuous predicates. If you try to read that text, it's very interesting if you become self-conscious and looks what happens to your mind when you are trying to understand that. But, then he came to this conclusion of the coincidence of opposites, that you can think a higher one which subsumes all the many. And that is obviously a concept which completely fits the idea of the one humanity, that we are one human species. We are not different races. We are one humanity, and we're sitting in one boat, and we have to think about our joint future if you want to solve the problems of the present. And therefore, I think, what goes beyond multipolarity is this idea of thinking the one humanity. And it's very difficult. People are used to think about their country first, America first, other countries first. But, I think that we have to arrive at a thinking where there is no contradiction between the one humanity and my country, because you can adjust the interest of your country to that of the one civilization of human beings. And I think that's the big challenge.
Well, for more on this question of the coincidence of opposites, and to actually participate in a discussion that takes up these themes that Helga's just been discussing, you can go to the schillerinstitute.com and download the conference from April 15th and 16th, where speakers from more than 30 countries engaged in this kind of discussion that Helga was just describing. So Helga, we've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us this week. And I think there are a lot of interesting questions percolating out there, and we just have to keep this process going.
Yes, and become active with us, because, this is a very exciting time, very dangerous. It could go all wrong, but you can already see that a new paradigm and a new form of cooperation among nations is thinkable and is possible. And join the Schiller Institute with our activities and spread the news about our recent conference. And just contact us, and you will find out that it will be very profitable for you and your mind.
All right, Helga, and we'll see you again next week.
Yes, till next week.